Hello, and welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 22 report. We will fill you in here on what happened over the last 3 weeks. Next slide. Okay, I'll be presenting the sprint statistics. Alberto will do the REST API. Greg, Brona, and Jason will talk about providers. Dan's going to talk about the user interface. Greg McCullough is going to talk about Foreman, orchestration, automate, and dialogs. Joe will talk about the appliance, and Jason will talk about the community. Next slide. Okay, this last sprint was a bit slower than the previous two, but pretty good pace nonetheless. We had 190 pull requests merged. Over half were bugs, 65 enhancement requests, 4 were technical debt, 7 refactoring, 6 tests. We still have a healthy number of open pull requests. We're at 120 as of this morning, as 31 of them were work in progress. And so I think we're making good strides here. Next slide, please. To Alberto for the REST API.
Alrighty, good morning. So this last sprint, we've enhanced the API providers collection to support the newer alternate provider class, and this enables us to do all the CRUD operations as well as refresh for the new providers like Foreman here as an example. So all the HTTP methods get post and delete can be redirected to the new class via the new parameter shown here, provider underscore classes provider. The request and response format is the same as the regular provider, so there's no change there. The only difference is that these are not full CI, so tag and policy management is not currently supported. And that's it for REST API. Next slide, please.
All right, so on the provider space, this time around we had we had a lot of changes in containers. 22 pull requests came in. A lot of it was kind of cleaning things up, getting ready for a demo they're trying to put together pretty soon here. A couple of the highlights are they added a manual refresh button that was missing before, just an oversight that got that in, and there were some UI updates. On the OpenStack side, one of the big highlights to point out is the auto scale of compute nodes. I've included a link to a demo that the OpenStack integration team put together. It's a really long demo. It's about 30 minutes, so I didn't want to show it directly in this demo, in the sprint demo. It doesn't really condense very well, but it's really worth watching. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on in there. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason to talk about some of the Amazon changes.
Okay. Amazon has been making a few changes lately with their instance types. So new is the D2 instance type, which replaces their HS1 instance type. So HS1 is still there. It's just not recommended for new instances, but you can still provision them if you need to. They also added a G2. They had a G2 instance type. They added a larger G2 instance type for high-performance graphics. That did not make this sprint by 1 day, so it'll be in the next sprint release. And that's it. Next slide.
Okay. So we made strides on 2 fronts with SCVMM. So the first one is we added Kerberos authentication support for the SCVMM provider. And the second one is we added support for SCVMM virtual machine provisioning, which I am going to demo. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so the provisioning workflow for SCVMM follows the same format as the other providers, so I expect it should be somewhat familiar to many of you. So I just run through provisioning a virtual machine from a template. Okay. So first we're going to select a template from our SCVMM inventory. And we'll fill out some requester contact details. And if you'd like to set a tag, this is the place to do so. So we shall create one virtual machine. We shall call it print MOVM. So the environment tab is where we decide where to place the virtual machine once provisioned. So I have one cluster with 2 hosts, and I'm going to select one of those hosts. And the available data store shall dynamically be updated. And if there was shared storage, they would be displayed here too. So I select my host and my data store. And the hardware tab is where we allocate CPU and memory to the virtual machine. So I'll give it 2 CPUs. And when it starts up, I will give it 2 gigs of memory. And if I select the dynamic memory box, memory will be allocated to the virtual machine on an as-needed basis, constrained by a minimum and a maximum. If I do not check that box, a fixed quantity of memory will be allocated to the virtual machine, in this case, 2 gigs. We set the CPU limits and reservations. So we'll give it a limit of, say, 50%, so as not to starve all the other virtual machines. We will give it a reservation of, say, 15. Network tab is where we configure which network this virtual machine shall belong to. And in the Schedule tab, we will provision immediately upon approval. Yes, we will power it on. And we shall not set a date to retire just yet. And we submit the request. So the request is in the pending approval phase. So this is where the request is compared to any quotas placed on the user and the group that the user belongs to. And then a decision is made whether to approve or deny this request. We'll just give it a couple of seconds and then we shall refresh. Okay, so our request was approved. Now we can jump over to SCVMM itself. And here we can see that our request was received by SCVMM and the job is running. Okay, the job has completed, and here we have our virtual machine in SCVMM, and it's actually stopped right now, but we did ask that it be powered on, and it is now being powered on. And now it's running. Let's check out the properties and make sure they were all set correctly. Okay, so we have 2 processors, which is correct. Here we have our 2 gigs of startup memory, our minimum memory, our maximum, because we set dynamic memory. Let's check the network adapter. Yes, it's on the RHQ network. And let's check the CPU limits and reservations. There we go. We have our 15 as our reservation, and our limit is 50. So it looks like all the properties were set correctly. Then we'll go back to ManageIQ, and we shall refresh our browser, and we shall look for the virtual machine. And there it is. And it's powered on. We got our CPU, our memory, our disk, everything looks as expected. And that's it.
That's awesome, Brona. That's
Great.
terrific.
Thanks. Okay, so next slide, I guess.
Yep, over to Dan.
All right. On the user interface side, we've spent a lot of time working on fixing a lot of bugs. There was a lot of refactoring that's been done the last several months, and it's all kind of been merged in. So we've spent a lot of time on bugs. So, but we did get some minor features in. We got some cleanup done on the Bootstrap and Patternfly implementation. Some tables were replaced. We'll probably be doing more of that in the future. For the IPv6, we got those changes in, so now the hostname field actually takes any type of an IP configuration like hostname, IPv4 or IPv6. The IP address was removed from edit. It still shows up in the summary screens. It's if the IP address is discovered, then that gets filled in by the backend. The smart proxy has been removed from the UI as well as the backend. The smart proxy is no longer in use, so that's gone. We got some tagging in for the Foreman objects. I think we saw some of that earlier, or we will see some of that in the Foreman thing. And then to get Brona's demo working, we had to make some minor SCVMM UI changes so that you can make it through provisioning and some other areas as well. And I think that's it on the UI side. Next.
All right. For Foreman in this sprint, I think we showed provisioning in the last sprint demo. We were collecting the tags during the provisioning dialog, but not actually just storing them with the request. They weren't being processed. So in this sprint, they're now being applied to the target system at the end of provisioning. And then we were trying to get in a bunch of inventory collection. The list of items that we have collected now are listed there. But the thing to point out is Foreman kind of retains the information 2 ways. From a host, it can have values set directly on it, or it can inherit from the host group, and the host groups are nested, so they can come from kind of any nesting layer in that host group. So we're not only collecting the data, but retaining the information about what's set directly on the individual items in case that's important for somebody to know. And the UI generally will expose the inherited value. That's most likely the one you care about the most, but through Automate, you can interrogate and find out what's set directly on the individual items. And then from Orchestration, we enabled the retirement support. Right now, it's largely back-end. If you retire the service knows that resource has retirement enabled and can retire it. In the next sprint or so, we'll enable the UI controls to retire directly from the individual stacks from those screens. So we need a little bit more work to do there, but the back-end work is all done, which is good. Next slide. All right, so in automate side of things, this was a request that we had for a while and came up when we did the last major round of retirement work, was being able to determine if a retirement was initiated by an individual user or if it was a system like a scheduled retirement event. So we're now pass a flag along so that you could use it in resolution if you wanted to drive to a different state machine depending on that value. And we also record with the resource, the VM, the service, or now the stack, the cloud stack, who initiated that request, so that you can go back and use that value either through Automate or it can be available in reporting UI at some point. And then for services, there's two instances that get used quite often: the bundle initialization and item initialization. So there was an issue with processing tags in that, which started kind of a chain reaction of wanting to really revamp and enhance those methods. So we were able to take a lot of the code out of there and move it into a common parser that both of those methods now use. And then it was enhanced with we fixed the tagging and then added some additional enhancements with being able to support the override of service names, the description, as well as VM names, and then the service cleanup if the provisioning fails. So that got in. Next slide. And then for Dialogs, all the Dialogs now have read-only support. We didn't have this before, so it wasn't always useful to put display text on the screen because somebody could then modify. We really wanted to be able to give somebody the ability to have static text on the screen, but we exposed this to all the controls. Some places where this can become useful is something like even orchestration provisioning, where we create the dialog based on the parameters of the stack, but the designer may not want to give the end user, the choice to modify values, but you still want to pass those values along. So an example would be the instance type to use for cloud provisioning. You might want to hard code that, but allow the user to see what value is being passed. That field can now be marked as read-only, and they can see it but not change it. And then the drop-down box used to be split. We had the standard one as well as the dynamic one, which called into Automate. As we've been making all of the dialog fields dynamic, we refactored that down to one single drop-down field type that now supports the dynamic flag. Otherwise, it works exactly the same as it did before. I think that's it. Next slide.
Okay, this sprint, one of the first things was we added the Cloud Init RPM to the Kickstart. So now the appliances, when they're built, will have Cloud Init. Unfortunately, we ran into an issue with just having Cloud Init on there would disable the SSH root access. So we're still trying to fix it up before we can upload an appliance with Cloud Init. And additionally, IP tables, previously, we would serve a static IP tables rule file in our code base. And so if you took an appliance, stashed your changes and brought down any new changes, any changes you've made to your local IP tables file would get overwritten. So instead of doing it that way with a static file in our code base, we tried building the IP tables rules via Kickstart. So there was two pull requests to do that. One of them was to add the accepted ports we want to whitelist, and then another one for setting the default of dropping input and forward requests. So those two are in, and we've been able to test that pretty successfully. Additionally, there was some work on bugs, and there's an outstanding issue with the VMware Vim broker growing in memory that we're still tracking. But we'll continue to be working on that this next sprint. That's it. Next slide.
Okay. Doc repository. Sometime back, I had spoken to the Red Hat OpenShift team about what they used for their documentation, and we really like their system. So I've been spending kind of my off hours trying to get their system such that we could have the same common core for building a documentation website shared between the two teams. Recently I've gotten a lot of work done where a lot of their hard-coded assets that were baked into their engine, I've kind of gotten separated out, and actually just last night I was able to run it locally as a standalone gem. So pretty soon we have a ManageIQ docs repo, and that will be using that gem. And then at that point, a lot of our documentation can then be built over there. So the ManageIQ docs repository will be for customer, user, whatever facing documentation, and ManageIQ guides will be solely for developer documentation. So one thing that I know is I think some documents have gotten into the ManageIQ docs repo already, and I know Alberto's been working on transferring the API docs from the guides repo over to this other repo. And hopefully pretty soon we can get an actual static site built with the documentation.
Hey, Jason,
yeah.
Can you kind of give an overview of what the benefits are of this new doc repo? Kind of what the users or developers, kind of how they benefit?
Sure. So one thing, the OpenShift docs repo has two really cool features. One is that it supports multi-product documentation. So for ManageIQ, we can build the ManageIQ docs. Red Hat can leverage it to build their CloudForms documentation using the majority of the documentation that's already there, and the documentation is written in ASCII doc, which is a common documentation format. Inside ASCII doc, there are conditionals, if you will, that you can put in the code and say, this code is ManageIQ only, this code is something else, and the 90% use cases, they're the same for both. So that's one really cool feature. The other thing it has is it uses Git branching to deal with different versions. So we can actually have different, as we move forward, you branch off versions of the documentation, and we could have a Botvinic branch and a non-branch, whatever C is, that has the documentation for that branch, and the docs can be generated for all the different versions at once and uploaded somewhere. And the ultimate final result is static HTML, so there's nothing complicated about it. So hopefully it makes the building docs for multiple versions and multiple very simple.
And is it easy to for users who see errors to make pull requests to contribute to that?
Correct. It's just a Git repo with ASCII doc files, which are flat text with a little bit of markup inside them. So pull requests, somebody sees a typo or they want to update the documentation, it's just a simple pull request. Then moving on to the Botvinic RC, one of the things we want to do is move some of the fixes that have come in this last sprint on master, backport them to Botvinic, and get Botvinic a little more stable. However, cutting a new RC doesn't really make sense yet until we can figure out the issue Joe was talking about with the VMware broker growing, and there's a couple other stability issues that we want to get through. So once we can figure those out, get those fixed and backport it, we'll probably cut a new RC at that time. I don't want to give a date because I don't know how long it's going to take to fix that. So we'll just have to play it by ear. That's really all there is on that.
We'll provide an update on the next Botvinic date at the next sprint demo, if you don't hear from
and that's it.
Okay, and that wraps up the sprint demo. I'll open it up to questions and comments. All right, well, seems like there's nothing in the Blue Jeans chat, or do I hear anyone on the phone asking anything? So I want to say thank you to the team, another very powerful sprint, and looking forward to more good things at the next sprint demo.
Hey, Oleg.
Yeah?
this is Kevin. I did have one, and it was mainly directed towards Dan. I was just curious why the host name or the IP address was being removed from the UI. I saw that in the 5.4 release recently, and I was trying to figure out what that was all about. And I apologize if you explained.
That's about supporting IPv6, and along with John Hardy, we decided that in large installations, the host name, one field should be enough, and people will use the host name mostly as the host name. But if you really want to use it as an IP address, you can put in an IP address there as well. But there's kind of no reason to have both.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I was just looking at a bunch of automate methods actually that you leverage the IP address, and so I was looking at having to refactor all those. So I was just curious at the logic behind it. Thank you, though.
Yep. Anybody else? Alrighty. Thank you all, and look forward to the next sprint demo in 3 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.